Welcome, everybody. I'm Caroline Bach. I am a member of the Washington Writers Publishing House, and I am here as the co-host of the evening with Jonah Colson, who is the co-editor of our new anthology, which we're going to read from today. And he is also the co-editor of our new biweekly uh, literary journal called WWPH Writes. So this is our anthology. This is who we are, this diverse, inclusive group of writers who 45 years ago came together as a hippie collective. It's way before my time. Hippie collective, founded by poets, including Grace Cavalieri, who is the state poet of Maryland. So Grace Cavalieri and others founded this organization 45 years ago as a hippie collective, and it has survived all these years as an all-volunteer, nonprofit, independent, small press. And what we primarily do is publish two books of a year, a book of fiction, either short stories or novels, or a book of poetry. And in fact, for all of those out there in Zoom land, we have opened our manuscript contest for 2021. So if you have a full length book of poetry or a full length book of short stories or a novel that you would like to submit, go to our website, washingtonwriters.org, and consider submitting to us. We are looking for writing that is lyrical. We are looking for writing that talks to this moment. We are looking for writing only from writers from DC, Maryland, or Virginia. And we've actually opened that this year to a wider uh, geographic area. We used to be only open to writers within 75 miles of the nation's capital, but now we've opened it to all residents of DC, Maryland, and Virginia. We've also increased the amount of our prize money. It's $1,500, so it's up $500 this year, mainly for everybody's hard work on the anthology, that we're able to pay it forward to more writers. So that's a little bit of our background. I don't want to talk too much because tonight we are going to hear readings from our new anthology. We're going to talk to you about what it means to be part of this unusual, small, nonprofit, all volunteer press that's been around for 45 years. And hopefully you'll hear our enthusiasm for our writing and want to be a part of us, either through your manuscripts or through contributing now to our biweekly journal, WWPH Writes. Last thing, I just want to thank Sean Murphy and everybody at 1455 who's done so much work to pull this together. It's really amazing that we're able to do this virtually these days. Jonah, do you want to add anything? I always feel like Jonah and I end up being talk show hosts in these things.
As always, I agree with everything Caroline says. Caroline's my partner in everything but marriage, so I really appreciate that. No, and thank you, Liz. Thank you, Sandra and Nicole and Andy. It's wonderful for everyone to be here this evening, and I'm looking forward to hearing your work from the anthology and beyond. Caroline, as you did mention, we do have a brand new journal, which came out of your spark, and we've got it to a really wonderful sort of the second and fourth Friday of every month. So the journal is called WWPH Writes, and I'm the poetry editor, and Caroline is the fiction editor, flash fiction editor. And we're really looking for poetry and fiction that celebrate, unsettle, and question our lives in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area, you know, our DMV area, because we're in a very, very unique position geographically, which is what makes the journal so interesting, and I think what gives what we publish as well. And sort of our cooperative press just gives it such an interesting edge. And I think that's why it's lasted for so many years. But, we're always seeking work that's lyrical, dynamic, and we believe in cultivating a diverse environment of content, form, risk, and experimentation. New perspectives and voices with craft and fierceness are strongly encouraged to submit. So if you take a look at our website and on submittable, please submit to WWPH Rights. There's also information there about our annual contest, which Carolyn has mentioned for fiction and poetry. So that's sort of what I would like to introduce. Caroline, should we get right into the, should we ask a question or should we get into the readings? I had a question. I kind of had a question about what some of our panelists were thinking or knew about WWPH before they submitted, if I may. So I know, Nicole, you've been published, your full-length poetry collection, How to Prove a Theory, was published. Was that 4 years ago?
It was 2017, Jonah, just the 1 year before you, 1 year before your book.
Years ago.
So I had the pleasure of helping select your book, Jonah.
That was so awesome.
And I heard about it at Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. A fiction friend, Dana, told me about WWPH. He was friends with Kathleen, and he said, if your book is done and I see it here hanging on the wall, you should send it in. And it was the first press I heard back from. First place I sent it and first press I heard back from.
Yeah, me too. I sent my first poetry collection out to, a bunch of places. And I heard from Nicole. Nicole called me and she said, we would like to publish this. I'm like, the Writers Washington Publishing House, like I've heard of it. I've seen it on, books. And I know it's probably in my MFA program at American University. And I believe I texted or face texted, whatever we do, Miss Sandra Beasley. And I said, Sandra, do you know anything about the Washington Writers Publishing House? And she did. And she told me about it. But Sandra, I was curious, how did you find all that knowledge? Had you been familiar with the publishing house before?
Oh yeah, my knowledge of WWPH goes back to the days of Moira Egan doing the collection Cleave, and Patrick Pepper, who I think was the president for something like 5 years. Yeah. So I mean, I moved like Jonah. I was in DC for my MFA program, and I knew about WWPH coming right out of 2005 as part of my involvement with the Writers Center and other organizations. So what I love, I'll be honest, my book is not published with you all, but the reason why I so often recommend it to folks is that I love that the social pact of co-creating not only the physical books, but the press's energy with promotions and organizing readings, it's all right there in the mission statement. And I feel like there's a lot of presses where it's right there, but it's not in the mission statement, and it doesn't kind of carry forward the way that it wants and needs to operate. So I just feel like there's a kind of honesty that inspires a great enthusiasm. I've known just so many great poets who published there.
Yeah, it was a little intimidating. I don't know how it was for Caroline or Nicole when I accepted and you signed the contract. It's like you have to do some service back to the press, the way it works, a volunteer cooperative press. And I didn't know what to expect. It was just totally new to me. I'd never been on the publishing side, but I have to say, you really get hooked and you really make these wonderful relationships, and it's a wonderful way to enter into a community, not only by publishing your own work, but publishing the work of others. It's just wonderfully satisfying. But Liz and Andy, had you heard of us before? Or Caroline, chime in, please.
Sure. I did my graduate work at George Mason in their MFA program, and that was the first place that I heard about the Washington Writers Publishing House. It was just kind of in the ether as, you know, a thing to be aware of and look into further. But of course, as a grad student, I was definitely wrestling with a lot of, you know, perfectionism and this kind of thing. So I never felt like I had a full-length manuscript ready to send off. So when this anthology opportunity came around, that is something I could get really excited about. That's right.
Well, Jonah, I know that I, as a rather new person to the DMV area, I moved down here 8 years ago, and I had two books published by one of those big five presses. Two young adult novels have been published by St. Martin's. But I was working on short stories, trying to work toward an adult novel and trying to find my voice for adults. And of course, I had got the rude awakening that it's very, very hard to publish short stories. And I thought, well, what about all these contests? And I was part of the Writers Center. As soon as I came down here, I started taking classes and eventually taught there. And I thought, I think I have a collection. I have all of these pieces, both from very short flash to some full length stories. And I started playing with it and I submitted it after having met Kathleen Wheaton, who is our wonderful publisher and president. And I will never forget the day that I got the call. I was racing between teaching classes, and she's like, "We like your book, you won." And I'm like, "Oh my God, I gotta get to class. Can I call you back in an hour and 15 minutes exactly?" And what I was surprised about working with the small press was the passion. You don't I mean, there's tons of reasons to be published by a big press, but the passion of having an event, you know, at Politics and Prose, and not having a huge writing community, being fairly new, but having everybody from the press who was in the area show up at Politics and Prose to support my book was so wonderful. And that was arranged by the press. And then a second event at the Writers Center. I know many writers are concerned, you know, about the visibility of their work. And I think as a small press, as in a volunteer press, we really make a big effort. In fact, this year we've even relaunched our website as well as relaunched as well as launched the anthology to raise our profile. And that was an idea that, you know, frankly, I brought to Kathleen and brought to you, Jonah. And everybody looked at me like and said, "Well, we haven't done an anthology in 25 years. Maybe it's time." And I was like, "Yes, I have an idea. It's from a chant I heard at the women's marches. What does America look like? This is what it looks like." And we, of course, Liz and Andy may not know this or only know this from the stories they may have heard, but this was right before the pandemic. So it was in our December meeting before the pandemic. And of course, you know, by the spring, we were wondering what was going on in the world and if we could do the anthology. And we literally got 1,000 submissions from about 500 writers and ended up expanding our initial idea from 50 writers to 100. So I'm so glad, Andy, Liz, Sandra, Nicole, that we were able to publish you in our anthology.
Andy,
I think we should maybe start introducing
well, I think
people.
Andy, had you heard of Writers Publishing House before?
I think I heard through like Twitter or Submittable, or there's like this this function on Submittable. If you want to find like writing opportunities, you just click this little button, and then I searched for like Virginia and DC, and it just kind of popped up. So that's kind of how I found out about it. Yeah.
I'm glad we popped up. That's awesome.
I am. And I think Andy and I also met on Twitter. He's a furious Twitter person.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Twitter's fun.
What kind of fury? What hates or angry Twitter?
Good energy Twitter. I'm not good on Twitter, but you know, that's one of the things like we've tried to do as a press is to expand the social media, which Caroline's been really, really good at.
And Sandra, Andy is not angry Twitter at all. He's funny and
I was just
comments on the world, and it's like I want to be Andy Tran on Twitter.
That's awesome. But yeah, so yeah, sure. Let's go into our readers. Is that okay, Caroline?
I think that's great. We're doing really well on time, and I want to make sure all our readers have a chance to share their work from This Is What America Looks Like and some of their other work, especially the poets, which I can't wait to hear. So
Great. So first up is Nicole Tong, and Nicole Tong is the author of How to Prove a Theory, which won the 2017 Gene Feldman Poetry Prize from the Washington Writers Publishing House. And she also serves as the inaugural Fairfax Poet Laureate. And she's a recipient of fellowships from Vermont Studio Center, Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and George Mason, where she received an MFA. So welcome, Nicole. So wonderful to have you here and to hear your poem, which I may ask a little follow-up question about because it's very, very, of course, it's beautiful and interesting.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks to Jonah and Caroline for this labor of love. I imagine it was just insanely difficult to put together this anthology during a global pandemic that was as inclusive and wonderful as it turned out to be. So thank you so much for your hard work and labor. I have a poem to read in Abecedarian. Aberrant Abecedarian. Abide by this patchwork of beginnings. The world does not end. Despite a cross over the body of the dead, a acrostic skeleton of only one bone, A. Inadequate these days, I am a lonely mathematician of anachronistic aesthetics, traveling by ambulance, anything to come to a starting place, unafflicted. I can't get to be. If painted all gesso and aggression, all marrow, no bone, both the backstory and what lies ahead, aimless as air, airwaves from home. This office now a classroom door ajar. Incoming dog begins to gnaw. Kindred as a kid, the neighbor's toddler sketches in chalk, aligns her feet to the shapes she's made on sidewalk. Amasses sticks should they need a nest. This ambiguousness does not bother her. No anecdote for anger, but soon all our annals annotated as if anxiously. A1 for the first peak to slow the spread. We wrote our year in apologies. Approaching approbation, a quarantine on display. Come meditate, be mindful. Catch us on Zoom happy hour. Argo for 2020. Artlessness aside, I admit I too tossed a sourdough starter. Assuaged my Catholic beginnings with prayer. Asthmatic and afraid, I atoned the old-fashioned way. Each rosary felt an apology, an audition for what might come next. A verse to verbs and their tenses. This holy American narrative, axioms, we're in this together. The eyes have it, this arrowed azimuth. Jonah, did you want to ask your question before I read from this or after I read?
I'm just going to ask. I'm going to ask it now, Nicole. I'm going to go for it. So could you maybe just tell us a little bit, because if you have the book and you see the layout of the poem, which is very, very important, you know, the style and the structure, could you tell us a little bit about an abecedarian, what it means, the poetic form, and maybe a little bit of the inspiration behind it?
So usually there would be 26 lines and it would go in alphabetical order A to Z. And this abecedarian goes from AB to AZ. It never gets to B. It feels like the Groundhog's Day of poems. And so that was the prompt that I gave myself to write the Bill Murray Groundhog's Day of poems. And this is what I came up with, the abecedarian that started the same way every time and never got to that second letter. So there were some challenges. There aren't many, for example, AO words. So I sort of cheated and wrote, A1 for the AO, but it was a fun little way to keep my mind occupied when I was otherwise just, the pandemic was a really hard time for those of us with anxiety disorders. And so it sort of gave me this circular mimetic loop to put my head around that sort of imitated the situation of the day to day and sort of kept it light as could be during that time. I think I submitted this the day it was due. So maybe you all took submissions until late May or early June, something of that nature.
Thank you. It's a beautiful poem. Thank you for that. And I love the line, this wholly American narrative, which I think really very often speaks to this entire anthology. It's really a wholly an American narrative. So thank you for that, Nicole. So please.
Thank you. All right, I'll read from How to Prove a Theory. Most of the poems in the book begin with some sort of theory or hypothesis. So let's see here. Speaking of anxiety, pink pill theory. What piled up gradually. I kept steady count. I did not need much. I did so regularly. Practice clouded the view, making it difficult to distinguish things seen from things seem. Inaccurate theory. There is a girl in an otherwise abandoned forest in which the girl counts backward from 30. Leaves resist their falling, the hum around her, the applause of blackbird wings. Light finds an opening. In this place, she is her own collapse. It's not like the dark room where a world hangs in the waiting and becomes. It's the instant where all is almost and lost. A leading chord fades, a sigh ruptures silence. Shiva summons the landscape in slow motion. She counts steadily to calm flocks of birds. When the wind won't take, there's no need to tether self from shore. And I'll read one more, and because of my setting, I think I'll read a little helicopter poem. I'm in Jacksonville, North Carolina, which is near Camp Lejeune. So the Marine Corps helicopters are overhead. So I thought I would read a helicopter poem called Chinook Theory. I just have to find it here. Okay, Chinook Theory, which is the helicopter, a wind, and a name for a Native American collective also. Having made gravel a kind of home, for 60 miles of footwork, I imagine my father alive. Each time the park police helicopter circles the Potomac beside the towpath. Imagined how measured the cargo when he operated the twin-engine monster. In the 70s, his silence, not a soldier's heart, but shell shock. Near a Marine base in North Carolina, my nephew monitors weather on the side of the mountains. He texts when he suspects changing trail conditions. Careful, Nicole, a Chinook may be coming, by which he means wind. But such a coincidence is not geographically precise on this Appalachian stretch, a country away from the correct coast. A year since I spent plucking feathers from a hospice bed. Were it possible to construct a bird to rise up and greet the dead?
Nicole, totally beautiful. Thank you for being you. Thank you for being part of this press. Thank you for those poems, and thank you for contributing to This Is What America Looks Like. And it's going to be helicopters. What a strange thing to think of with poetry. But I also know that Miss Sandra Beasley has, in one of her poems, she talks about these elegant helicopters. I love that. So I love helicopters and poetry together. So thank you, Nicole. So beautiful. So I'll throw it back to you, Caroline, for our next reader.
Wow, what a way to start. Our next reader is Andrew Tran. And I was looking for the expanded bio he sent me, which I'm going to apologize to say I can't find. And why did I have him send me an expanded bio? Because his original bio in This Is What America Looks Like is the shortest bio. It's only one line. Andrew Tran is a fiction writer from Virginia. And I know he's written numerous short stories and been published. And he has a wonderful story for us, Garcon Insurance, to share. Andrew, is there anything else from your bio that you would like to share before you start?
Nothing really. I'm working on a short story collection and a novel. Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. That's big. So Andrew Tran, fiction writer from Virginia, work in progress, short story collection and novel. Now we'll read his wonderful short story, Garcon Insurance, from our anthology.
Can you guys hear me? Okay. I was concerned about everything and concerned about nothing. As I sat on my front porch and drank a cup of black coffee mixed with oat milk, I was figuring out how my brain worked. I had severe depression and anxiety, and I was just learning how to cope. I left my front porch and went into my house. I walked up the stairs to the second floor and went into my bedroom, climbed out the window, stepped onto the rooftop. I laid my back down on the rough shingle tops and soaked up the bright sunlight, knowing even if I'd never figured out the meaning of life, at least I had my drawbacks. I was sleep deprived and looking into the sky, trying to see if there were angels flying through clusters of clouds. No angels dropped down from the clouds, which made me disappointed. Not a single bird flew by either. I was 19 years old and I believed in communism, but I was also Vietnamese American, which gave my belief system irony. And then when I realized I was lying to myself and that I believed in nothing. When I used to feel inspired, I would sit at my desk and draw 3-panel comics on computer paper using a black ballpoint pen. One of my comics was about a communist named Andrea who lived in a city like Chicago or Philly, and she spent her time plucking blossoming flowers from the gardens of the rich people living in the surrounding suburb. She sold magnolias, roses, and violets and brought them back to her apartment, fitting them in tall emerald vases. Never got caught. I stood up and walked to the other side of the rooftop, started to run, and then I jumped into the large blue pool into my next door neighbor's backyard. Sprays of water splashed up as I sank into the chilly deep end. I looked around and found there was a deflated volleyball sitting on the bottom of the pool. I spread my arms out and kicked my feet, swimming towards the volleyball. I grabbed it and swam back up to the surface. The air was warm and humid when I saw my head out of the cold water. As I crawled out of the pool with the volleyball under my arm, I wondered when the Fongs, my neighbors, were coming back from their vacation. I was house sitting for them while they took a backpacking trip across from Vietnam and Cambodia, and they'd been gone for a week already. And today was when they'd come back. I just didn't know what time. They're Vietnamese American too, so I presumed that was why they had selected me to house sit. They had a fluency in speaking Vietnamese that I would never be able to match. I didn't understand it when they spoke the language, and I could say simple phrases in conversation. They had a lanky black cat with a white belly named Garcon, and a lime green gecko named Insurance. And I've been feeding them for the past seven days. For now, Garcon and Insurance were completely reliant on me, and knowing I had this responsibility also made me anxious and neurotic. I've been paid $90 up front, and there was $90 for when the job was finished. I dried myself off with a raggedy beach towel, put on black sunglasses, and sat in a lawn chair, lighting up a spliff that rolled earlier when I'd been concerned. I smoked the spliff and felt the high creeping in on me, my head feeling light, serene, sulky. My house, my neighbor's house stood right next to each other, almost too close, my vinyl siding touching the red brick. I heard a meow and glanced behind me, and there was Garcon sitting on my shoulder. I stroked his head and breathed in the summer air. When I walked inside the house, I was carrying Garcon in one arm and the volleyball in my other. I set the volleyball down on the one dining table in the kitchen and then went to the living room to check on insurance. There was a huge glass container sitting on a long black dresser, filled with smooth stones, patches of golden sand, sediment, a tiny green pond, and a miniature pink house. I looked inside into the glass container and I couldn't find insurance. Fuck me, I said. I took the large plastic lid off the container, reached inside, and lifted the pink house. Insurance slithered out and dipped slowly into the green pond. She winked at me. I waved at insurance. Then I remember there was a gecko. And geckos in blank, or at least that's what the internet told me when I pulled out my phone and searched in Google. I sighed and laughed as I walked down the hallway to the kitchen. As I chewed on a strawberry gummy worm, I noticed that the sliding glass door was still open in the family room. The volleyball had sunk into the carpet, a huge gash running through the white foam. I swallowed the gummy worm and felt like I was the worst pet sitter in the history of pet sitters. I walked across the family room and stepped out to the concrete patio area. I looked at the pool and there was Garcon resting on the edge of the yellow diving board. Stay put, I told Garcon, as I circled around the pool heading to him. His back rose up and he flashed his tiny white teeth. I thought he was snarling at me, but instead he was yawning, his eyes sleepy. I walked up the steps of the diving board and walked across it, stretching hands out. As I got closer to Garcon, I lunged forward and reached for his legs, but I missed and Garcon scratched my forearm with his paw. Then I tumbled backwards into the pool, splashed into the cold water, feeling like I was everything and nothing. I held my breath and closed my eyes. I saw my comic book character, Andrea, in the water. She was wearing a red swimsuit. She had long black hair draped over her slender shoulders, green eyes and freckles. She swam over to me and kissed me on the lips, tasting like rust and chemicals. It also felt blissful, and in the moment I was grateful. I closed my eyes and she was gone, and then I was all alone again. I lifted myself out of the pool and saw blood leak out of the small cuts in my forearm. I wiped the blood off with my towel. I wiped the blood off with the towel, and then I walked back into the family room. I couldn't believe Garcon had slashed me up, and I'd be lying if I didn't feel betrayed. I swung my foot forward to kick the deflated volleyball and ended up slipping on it. My head hit the floor and everything went black. When I woke up, Mr. Fong was standing over me with his hands stuck out. You okay? He asked me. I nodded and grabbed his hand. I'm alive. Where's Garcon? I can't wait to see him, he said, pulling up to my feet. He looked me up and down. You look rough, kid. What happened? He pointed at my forearm. Oh, I went for a run and ran to a tree branch. Really? Yep. Miss Fong walked into the family room and smiled at me. Thanks for house and pet sitting, Andrew. She walked over to me and gave me a hug. Oh, she said, taking a step back. You're wet. I was in the pool earlier. I did a few laps. Good exercise, huh? Miss Fong said. The best. She smiled again. But this time it didn't seem authentic. She turned to the side and pointed down the hallway. Did you take out insurance and play with her? I didn't see her in the container. My hands were shaking and I shoved them back into the swim trunk pockets. I shook my head and said, she's probably in the pink house. She's not. I checked, Miss Fong said with a frown, and the container lid was open. I knew I was going to have to lie again, but I didn't know what to say. And as I opened my mouth to speak, there was Garcon skittering away quietly into the family room. He purred, and there was something small and green swinging from his teeth. He was holding insurance by her tail, and she looked frightened and worn out. Blood dripped onto the carpet. Mr. Fong looked at Miss Fong. She looked back at him, and then they both looked at me and started cursing me out in Vietnamese. Mr. Fong spat Garcon on the back of the head, and Miss Fong started to cry. Garcon spat out insurance, and she landed on the floor and scrambled out of the family room, past the halfway open glass door, slithering into the backyard. Miss Fong picked up insurance and Pick yelled at him, and he made a face. Mr. Fong rushed outside, stepping out to the patio, looking around for insurance. He looked back at me and told me to get the hell out. I nodded and said sorry in Vietnamese, then sorry in English. Words came out in a jumble. I started to walk out the family room. Miss Fong was standing in front of the kitchen, bouncing Garcon up and down on her arms and crying. She raised her fist at me and yelled, so I turned around and walked up the patio and closed the door behind me. Mr. Fong was searching under the lawn chairs and the lawn table. He checked the tall green trees bordering the pool, and then he marched around the pool, looking to the deep blue water. I inhaled, exhaled. I told him I apologized for screwing things up, and I really was sorry. I really was. Mr. Fong wasn't listening to me anymore. He sat on the edge of the pool and covered his face with his hands. He was muffling his screams. As I began to walk out the backyard, I saw insurance blending in with a pile of fallen green leaves, then scrambling to the tall stalks of grass. I chased after him as he swarmed deeper into the grass and dirt. He was burying into the ground. I got on all fours and reached out with my hand to grab him. Thanks.
Andrew, did I ever tell you how much I enjoyed this story? We got
Thanks.
tons of stories that were very deep and depressing and pandemic related by May, when we were wrapping up the anthology. And your story had this wonderful, ironic voice, this sort of uh, just kid trying to like do right. And I'm wondering if you, when you look back at this story, would you have written it today? Post pandemic, post where we are in the world today?
I don't know, because like, I tend to write my stories like based on like what's going on right now in the environment. So I guess it would shift a little, in terms of like what I would talk about, but I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you see the main character is named Andrew? I took this as fiction. Um, do you think of this as fiction? I didn't question you because I know a lot of
Yeah.
writers, myself,
Yeah.
often use my own name in stories,
Yeah.
certain kinds of stories.
I never sat for pets and my neighbors don't have pets, but yeah. But I've been in their backyard and checked out their pool. That's about the only thing that's true about that.
So it's fiction.
Yeah, it's fiction. Yeah.
It's fiction. Well, there's a wonderful uh, dry sense of humor in this piece that I just love. And I thought was in wonderful contrast to some of our really serious pieces. So thank you for submitting it. Do
Thanks
you
for letting me
often,
read, Caroline, and thanks for having me on the panel, and Nicole, Liz, and Sandra. Appreciate it.
no, Andrew, I think you have quite a future in front of you. I can't wait to see where you're going with that short story collection and novel. So
Thank you.
we're going to stay in touch.
Andrew, you were reading at the Inner Loop at my first reading with my new book, and I felt like the whole night I was floating, but I loved your writing. When I heard it way back at the Inner Loop, I don't even remember that evening, what iteration that was, but you were so excited, and I was so excited at your excitement.
I think what the poem that Nicole read and also what Andrew read raises an interesting question, which could be a panel in itself, is addressing the self in your work, whether it's you or just the name, because Nicole had Nicole in a poem, Andrew had Andrew in a poem. I don't know if Liz has Liz in her writing or Sandra. I don't think I've read Sandra and Sandra's writing. I have one poem that actually references me, but not as me, as like the biblical Jonah character. But it's curious. Like, how do you reference oneself? And as Caroline said, is it creative nonfiction? Is it fiction? Is it just someone who knows you very well? Is it just another character with your name? I mean, it's an interesting. That's very curious. So thank you for sharing that.
Our fictional selves that we like to put out there, right, Andy?
Yeah, that's really curious. Thank you. Should we keep going with the next poet, or would you like to
Yeah.
ask a question, Caroline?
Well, I think, well, I asked Andrew the question about would you write the same piece now, post pandemic, post social reckoning, or has your writing changed? And I'm wondering if any of the other writers have a thought to that. Has your writing changed, Liz, in the past year?
Yes, I think the biggest change in my writing has been more in the process. I think in the pandemic, because I think everybody's creative response is a little bit different. I think I gained a lot of courage to start new projects, but gave myself permission to not finish them. So I've got from about the past year and a half, like a couple dozen half fleshed out starts to things that are things I like and I'm interested in them. And I'm looking forward to more organized headspace when I can tackle them. But yeah, I kind of let go of the feeling that, well, I can't start that new thing until I finish that other thing. So it was sort of a weird kind of cracking open and redesigning a process more than a shift in the things I wanted to write about. I did see a very funny tweet that I related to that essentially said something like, all the poets out here writing quarantine poems and fiction writers are, just not really touching it at all. And I will say, I have not myself written about the pandemic or the quarantine. And I don't know that I will, but it's been a weird creative stifling, but also a weird creative blooming for me. So it's very confusing, but I'll take it.
Right. Oh, that's so interesting about process changing. Nicole or Sandra, has your process changed? Has your writing changed in the pandemic year? It'd be interesting to hear from a poet's point of view.
Go ahead, Sandra, and then I'll take it after you.
Sure. Well, I probably have I have one of the larger like external reasons why my writing has changed. I had a book come out in April, and that's a whole other conversation what it's like to launch a book in the past year, as these editors can sympathize. But the book that came out was poetry, but the project that I'm doing now is nonfiction. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's in fact researched nonfiction music writing, and it has some framing personal narrative, but it's not personal essays, it's not memoir. So for me, there was a kind of hard cut in I had made the last of the changes to the poetry manuscript that I could, and I was waiting for that to come out, and I started planting the seeds for what is now a new book in a different genre. So, and I have to say that feels good. I have to also say that I'm glad to be doing something that is heavily externally oriented, because this collection in particular did feel autobiographical in a way that I don't always kind of surrender to be honest. And I'll talk more about that when I read my selection. But yeah, I'd love to hear from Nicole.
Yeah, I started the year 2020 and I was just really trying to write odes, odes and celebration and happy poems. And my partner sort of challenged me, will Nicole write a happy book this time? Because I wrote a collection of elegies. And so, people may get through and then they're like, whoa. Because it's sort of like I had a year where everybody died and I didn't know I was writing a book of elegies, but it turns out I was writing a book of elegies the whole time. And sort of the life process sort of said, oh, these are actually elegies, what I've been doing. And so this time I was sort of more conscious about wanting to write odes and just in new form, sonnets, lots of love. And then the pandemic happened and it was really messing with my plan to stay positive and hopeful. And so when I couldn't, I just switched genres and started writing some nonfiction about running ultra marathons, long distances. And so that's been wonderful. I've never written about running. I'm a terrible runner. So like no one wants to read this writing about how bad of a runner I am, like what a slog it is. But I really love writing it. It is really pretty cool to switch genres, I think, especially when you're feeling a little bit of a hang up, like I want to be doing this, but it feels like writing the last 10 poems for this book, only it already came out. So I'm writing them, I'm letting them happen, but sort of tucking them away and saying, you know what, I think I published that book already. So but great question, Caroline.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting that as writers, we're giving ourselves permission to do something new, and I'm in that camp too. I didn't think I was going to start a new novel, and I, for the first time, thought I could write about the other great national tragedy that I was part of, which I never thought I'd be able to write about, which was 9/11, when I was in New York and working in Manhattan. And I gave myself permission. I said, you can finally write about it. You never thought there would be anything worse than that. And now you're in a pandemic. So I gave myself permission to write about something I really didn't think I would. And it's been fun. You don't realize how much the world's changed in 20 years. So I've had to do some research back, and remember I had a BlackBerry, and there was pre-texting at the moment, and all these other sort of, technical things that the world's changed. Has been interesting from a writerly point of view. Andy, has your writing process changed during the pandemic? It seems like you're very prolific.
Changed a little. I feel like I've, maybe written. It depends. Like I go through like spouts of like writing a lot of stuff, and then like writing like not as much stuff, and so, yeah, really depends on my mood, basically. More so the pandemic, but yeah.
So you've had waves. You've had waves. And you,
Yeah.
Jonah, has your writing process changed?
Yeah, I've written like 2 poems. I haven't written much at all, but I've been translating. So I translated 2 books. So you want to keep working, but I just remember, I just felt like, you're so involved in the pandemic that I can't write about it or even write in it. I don't know. It almost was like just a void. And I was working on this anthology during the pandemic, got me through, and then I took up other projects when I needed to translate other people's wonderful poems. But I haven't been working actually my own original work. I'm starting to a little bit more now, but it's hard. It's strange when things change and you have a process, and suddenly you have kind of all this time to write, and then when you have the time, you don't do it. So it's it becomes a very interesting idea.
This is the Twitter joke that everyone who is not a writer wrote during the pandemic, and none of the writers wrote during the pandemic.
Yeah, isn't that strange? I don't know. Like, when everything else was happening, and you want to go into the you want the workshops, you want the retreats, you want the time to write, and then suddenly I was given time to write, and I didn't write. So I don't know what's happening there. Someone far smarter than me can maybe figure that out, but it's very strange.
As a spatial thing, it was just so weird to write at home. I found so much of my writing was, outside, outdoors, on a lawn, at a park, at a coffee shop. There was a lot of writing at coffee shops.
And it couldn't happen. It was just took on a different experience.
Well, I think from a press point of view, a small press like the Washington Writers Publishing House, we took a break from accepting manuscripts because of the anthology. And we had this flood, which, as Jonah said, it took us a whole year to put the anthology together, but we put our annual contests to the side. So we have not had an open call for submissions since our 2020 season. And so I am very curious for all the writers out there, if you're going to flood us with manuscripts of poetry and short stories or a novel this year. We are open for submissions, and I can tell you they look robust, and we've only been open since July 1st. So we have kept our submission fee the same while we raised our prize money. So it's $25 to submit. But as I said before, we raised our prize money. We do events for all our writers at Politics and Prose and Writer Center. They'll be featured in our WWPH Writes newsletter and on our new website. So that's my second commercial break for our press. But it does make me like so curious, crazy. I almost want to start like a betting pool, Nicole and Jonah, who are going to be judging along with me and our other members, how many entries we will get this year. So
It'll be really
something to think about as we go on with our uh, readings tonight. And
interesting.
we're doing really well on time. And we should now introduce Jonah, our wonderful next panelist.
Yes, absolutely. I have the pleasure of introducing Sandra Beasley, who, if you think of DMV writers or DC writers, I mean, you have to think of Sandra Beasley. And she is totally amazing, a beautiful spirit inside and out, and just adored. And let me read your official biography. Sandra Beasley is the author of Made to Explode, which just came out, as she had mentioned in April. Count the Waves, I Was a Jukebox, and Theories of Falling, which was her first poetry collection. And Don't Kill the Birthday Girl, Tales from an Allergic Life, which is a disability memoir. She also edited Vinegar and Char, Verse from the Southern Foodways Alliance, and she lives in Washington, DC. And we're so happy to have you here, Sandra, and thank you for sharing this wonderful poem in the anthology, which is something I actually watched. I never watched sports, but I watched this because it was such a big deal for DC. So please, Sandra.
Thank you so much. Jonah, if you don't mind, so what I'd like to do is I will read that poem, of course, but I actually want to situate it in between the other poems that I was going to read, if that's okay. Because what I wanted to do was share the fact that, so this poem that I'm going to read from the anthology is only in the anthology. I pulled it from this book. And so if you, in a weird way, if you want the complete experience of Made to Explode, you have to have this anthology. And you're welcome to ask, if I don't fully explain, you're welcome to ask like why that is as a question. But what I want to read is a suite of 4 poems that are all very much set in DC. I'm going to do something I don't usually do, which is really conflate author and speaker. These are poems drawing on what it was like from 2016 on to be in the space of living blocks from the Capitol in a city that, as a city, had voted 93% blue, that all of a sudden found itself infused by not just red, but supporters of an administration that we just fundamentally did not believe was a proper one. And so I'm not trying to make that overly political, but I can't underemphasize how displacing it felt. And of course, at various points, that translated to a day where I could barely go about my business because of overhead helicopters, or looking out and seeing armed guards on a local street corner, or watching as our daily stroll was interrupted by gates that went up. And so it was a really intense time. And what I will read first is 2 quick poems that show to me the kind of calm before the storm. We were living in a building designed by I.M. Pei. We were right down by the mall. Big things had happened with the election, but we didn't know if they were real yet or how they would manifest. And what you'll hear are 2 poems of just kind of quiet domestic spaces. My husband in 2016 was, among other things, he worked at a landscaping and terracing company, which will make sense when in the second poem you hear a lot of mention of someone bringing in mulch into the apartment. So these are from Made to Explode, and then I'll read the poem from This Is What America Looks Like. Little Love Poem. The 6 a.m. sun considers everything, humming its way past the Capitol. I reheat yesterday's coffee, put lima beans in a pot, forward hook, always forward hook, drizzle of olive oil, pinch of salt, shake of chili flakes. The chicken broth comes to boil for a minute before I cover, simmer. Soon he'll wake and I'll ask him to put a record on, something with no words, bowls, spoons, a single twist of pepper. This other poem came out of a request to write a still life poem. I called it Still Life with Sex. And I was reading it for an international audience the other day. And what was funny was that in all of the poems I read, they totally got the Americanisms and the political sides, but I had to explain what Magnum PI was. Because if you're a couple that works certain hours, you're only going to connect during the hours of syndicated television, in which case Magnum PI may in fact be the soundtrack to your dinner. Still life with sex. But first, a skull grinning amongst the grapes. But first, hydrangea moons barely risen. But first, milky bowls congregating in the sink and sticky spoons congregating in the bowls. But first, that vegetal stink. But first, clank of pipes filling with air. But first, dirt on your end of a couch. But first, dirt from your Monday shoes. But first, a canteen of water. But first, 5 loggers. But first, Magnum PI. But first, Tom Selleck. But first, kiss me because you clutter the pewter. Kiss me because you track in necessary dirt. Picture a violin, then add prosciutto. We are trying to make space and hold it open. The skull that grins amongst grapes grins at us. But first, those globes of hydrangea, there they are, perfect and cratering to our touch. So you hear two poems that are trying to hold space. They're trying to suggest that calmness can be created even amidst an external storm. And then this poem, which appears in the anthology, it's a prose poem. The storm feels unavoidable. Something that should be a source of great joy kind of collides with a time of real self-doubt. It's called Stanley Cup. And I'll mention that it does have some fixed ideation patterns of self-harm. So if that is a trigger for you, I would invite you, if you want, to mute just for a few minutes. Stanley Cup. The night Washington won the Stanley Cup, I stepped out on the balcony. Disembodied cheers echoed across the courtyard of our building from the other side of the duck pond, down 6th Street Southwest. The next morning, a suitcase was by the door, boxy with a cheap plastic handle. This was what would weigh me down if I jumped from the Frederick Douglass Memorial Bridge. The husband could not see it. The cat did not sniff it. But before jumping, I wanted to know more about the Stanley Cup. There are 3 cups, actually. The original 1892 Dominion Hockey Challenge Cup, which cost 10 guineas to make, the Presentation Cup, and the one on display at the Hall of Fame in Toronto. I researched etching the rings and how, before they decided to rotate rings off, the cup looked like a stovepipe. I studied the corrections. When the NHL struck Basil Pocklington's name, they replaced it with 16 X's. Adam Deadmarsh became Adam Deadmarch, and then Deadmarsh again. Meanwhile, the Capitals took the cup to a Nats game. Alex Ovechkin did a keg stand from its bowl, then swam the cup through a Georgetown fountain. 6 Caps got tattoos of the cup, the actual cup on hand for visual reference. I went to Tyson's Corner Mall, and the Stanley Cup was getting sushi with the team a floor below. When someone asked how I was doing, I answered, "We won the Stanley Cup." My father gave me a Stanley Cup champions t-shirt and commemorative puck. I had possession. I could see the net, but I wanted to be checked. I shot wide to the right, wide to the left. I aimed for the crossbar. I was taking any shot I could to keep me from my actual goal. And I'll just, I'll finish with one short poem that I was in a workshop and Ross Gay challenged us to write something that made us happy. And my happiness came from this perverse fact that my cat, whose previous owner had died, would despair every time I traveled for work because she thought I had died. In her mind, if you disappeared, you were dead. But then I would come back. And my mysterious source of joy was seeing my cat's reaction when I would come home from trips. Lazarus. The cat flops and swims along the carpet, ecstatic in her clawing, because I am alive, despite the 3 days absence that she took as my death. She could vomit in sheer joy, and later she will. But for now, it's headbutts and pantomime of mewing with her jaw that ached and ran dry of sound after my first night gone. Though I know each of us would be better off if she did not care quite so much, if she displayed the feline diffidence promised, water, kibble, company, she'll be fine. I confess to delighting in this small miracle I perform in her eyes, this resurrection. After a brief pause to lovingly tend to her own asshole, the cat resumes her yawp and purr. Could I learn to greet the world this way, to take nothing for granted? First, I'd have to think you all had died, of course, but death would be temporary. Truth is, I've tried otter roots to ecstasy. So thank you so much. And so I hope that in some ways you can hear how Stanley Cup is in dialogue with those poems in a kind of narrative. But I pulled it, and I pulled it in part because I kept struggling with editorial decisions that told me I had not fully separated speaker from poet yet. It was in some ways as much a flash nonfiction as it was a poem. And so I just thought I'm just gonna keep it in a separate space, and then felt like it was kind of the lightning strike I needed when you all asked for something.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sandra. It's a perfect fit for This Is What America Looks Like. And thank you for those wonderful poems. I can't tell you how much I had a crush on Tom Selleck. I mean, my God, it was like everything. And I'm you know, my partner kind of looks like Tom Selleck, so it's kind of cool.
Yeah, chose them wisely.
So totally great. And lots about cats here too. I love it. I don't have a cat, but my dog would not care if I left for weeks. She'd be like, whatever. But that's totally amazing. Thank you. So maybe just Sandra, as a quick follow-up before we get to our next amazing reader, Liz Egan, thank you. How do you feel, maybe I'll just ask sort of something slightly extraneous, but how did the Stanley Cup sort of factor in to maybe a narrative of Washington, D.C.? How do you feel? I know there's a lot more complications happening within the poem, but what do you think that did for the morale, just if we're talking about the DMV area?
And I'll keep my answer short because I'm so excited to hear Liz. I don't know. I grew up going to Bullets games, which of course later became the Wizards. It was fun to watch and I had a quote unquote I had a Red Slurs sweatshirt back in the day. So in other words, in my childhood, I had celebrated the success of two teams, but it was so exciting and intriguing to watch two different sports have teams that lifted us up. And I'm not joking about hearing people out on their balconies banging pots and cheering. And the next time I got to hear that was with the confirmation of the election results. Yeah. So I feel like that kind of public rapport was something that we really needed. And then again with the World Series not that long after.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sandra. Thank you for being here and sharing these wonderful poems. Thank you. Caroline, back to you for our next reader, please.
Yes, I have to say I love Sandra's cat poem. It's the most sensual cat poem I've read. But I'm here to introduce our next reader, our last from the anthology, and then Jonah and I are going to share just a little bit of our work. But I'm really thrilled to share with you Liz Egan, because she has an asterisk next to her name. We did something different with the anthology that the press had never done before. Again, we're a 45-year-old press and we're trying to do some things new. And the new thing we did is decide, and I think this was Nicole's suggestion actually, that we should, for the anthology, invite people who have roots in the DMV to contribute. And what we were really looking for were people who sort of understood that the DMV has a sort of unique intersection. And Sandra, you just spoke to that we're a place where anything that happens in the nation's capital affects us to some extent. And the writers who we accepted who were not firmly based here sort of address that idea of the personal as political, as the history and politics and personal come together, I think, in the DMV area, or people who have lived here or went to school here for some time often leave and realize they have this nugget that came from this area. So Liz wrote a piece that particularly addressed this intersectionality, and I'm eager to hear her share it, but let me tell you who she is first. Liz Egan teaches creative writing and directs the Centers for Writing and Academic Success at Millsaps College in Jackson, Mississippi. She holds, though, an MFA from George Mason University, where we got many wonderful submissions from. Her fiction has appeared in SFW Quarterly, another wonderful local DC press, Mayday Magazine, I'm not going to, Parhelion, am I saying that correctly? Sure. And Ink and Coda, and was listed as a 2016 Gertrude Stein Award finalist. And I was thrilled she'd submitted, and I can't wait to hear her read her piece of flash fiction.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you, Jonah, and all the other writers. This has been such an enjoyable evening. Yeah, I was as thrilled to be invited to participate as I was to think about what I wanted to submit for your call for submissions. My great grandmother, Elizabeth Egan, is my namesake, and she and her husband started their lives together in Washington, D.C. as immigrants from Ireland and Germany. And so there's just been family connections and roots in D.C. my whole life. I've spent several, phases of my life living in and out of Washington, D.C. And as context for what I'm going to read, I am a former military spouse. And so I met my then husband in Washington, D.C. and became divorced from my husband in Annapolis, Maryland. So keeping that circularity going, but to link back to Nicole, where you are right now, we lived for a duty tour in Emerald Isle, North Carolina, right near Camp Lejeune. And so a lot of what I was writing that draws from that Delmarva area kind of is very much connected to what I experienced as a military spouse. And so I'll read this. It's a short flash fiction piece from the wonderful anthology, and it's called Get Some. A Marine coming home from war walks across a TV screen muted in the waiting room of the Warrior Clinic at Walter Reed. A daytime talk show is filming the Marine at his kid's school. The kid bursts into tears to see his father there, so unexpectedly, so frighteningly shrouded in exploding light. The Marine looks uncomfortable, his smile fades. The boy can't stop crying, and it's not the kind of crying the camera crews were hoping for. The Marine hunches over his son, holds his hands over the boy's face, and tries to shield him from the light. The shot pans out, cuts to a reel of welcome home banners strewn across the fence at the main gate at Quantico. Cuts again to clips of Marines loading trucks, cleaning weapons, climbing into planes, shouting "Oorah," ready to go. Cuts again to the soft clatter of the silent drill at 8th and I. Another photo reel plays before the segment ends, this one showing rows of young men standing outside recruitment offices. They perform for the cameras, flexing their arms and lifting their shirts to show off their coiled muscles while they stand in line, waiting to get in. So that piece, thanks. That piece is probably one of the more commentary driven pieces I've written so far about my experiences in the military. You know, thinking about this idea of identity and how that shows up in writers. I think there's a lot of freedom in being a fiction writer. You can kind of hide behind the claim that everything's made up, but there's certainly lots of places in telling the kinds of stories that are important to me to tell, where it's sometimes thickly and sometimes fairly thinly veiled version of this yourself, this self, even if you've given that self a different name and a different way of examining the world. So it's been an interesting experience reflecting now as we're pulling out of Afghanistan and watching the nightly news and seeing clips of you know, images that I haven't seen in over 10 years, and kind of flashing all back to all of that, and the lifestyle that I was living at that time as a military spouse, and thinking about just kind of, you know, what does it all mean and what does it say about what America looks like? No, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, Liz, I found this a very powerful piece because it's somebody so closely observing a scene who knows it so well, but where the narrator isn't there. It's You've made it all about that moment, which is often the flash fiction strength, where you capture the gut punch of the moment. Actually, a fellow DC writer who is in here, Leslie Petrick, calls it the gut punch. And I thought you really captured it. And I was wondering about your choice of form. Do you often write in flash fiction? Because I know I go between very tightly written flash and novels.
So pretty rare actually for me to write in flash. I tend to be the writer who just sort of vomits all over the page, and then the art is in the cleaning it up. You know, Anne Lamott's downdraft, and then, you know, you pull it back up. So I think the pandemic gave me an opportunity to, I felt like I couldn't, I think I said earlier, I felt like I couldn't really finish projects at the time, but it felt like, okay, but I can encapsulate this little bit. And that little bit actually is lifted out of a short story. You know, sometimes you write something and you just have to let it go to its literary grave. But that one piece, I was trying to save this whole story because I had this one kind of moment in it that I really liked. And then I realized, you know, maybe that moment is the story, and maybe that's what it can be. So kind of changed my thinking about it into the lens of writing as a flash piece, and it just all kind of clicked together.
Well, I'm so glad you saved that moment because, like I said, it's a gut punch. You got it. I think it even resonates more today than it did a year and a half ago when I first read it because of the way the world has shifted. You know, it's so interesting how we can only read through the lens of the moment we are, historical moment we're in. Uh, I'm hoping this in 10 years still resonates, our little anthology, Jonah. Um, well, I think Jonah and I, thank you, Liz, so much, and all of the readers. I think Jonah and I, if we had time, we thought we would share one piece from our collections so that if there are writers out there thinking, I want to submit to the Washington Writers Publishing House, which, as I have said, our submissions are now open. The judges are the members of the press. It's open now through November 15th. And we would love to see your writing if you are anywhere in the DC, Maryland, or Virginia area. And I think Jonah and I, we have met because we were both winners in 2018. I think we did a dozen readings together. Realized we liked each other a lot. And we became co-editors of the anthology and are also our WWPH Writes bi-weekly journal now. So I think we're stuck together, Jonah.
They're being modest. They
I
will
love
soon
it.
be the co-presidents of the press together. And they have not mentioned that yet, but there you go.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. No, we haven't mentioned it, but yes, next year in June of 2022, I cannot even say it. Jonah and I will be the co-presidents of the Washington Writers Publishing House. Thank you, Nicole. And Nicole will stay on as a board member, and Kathleen Wheaton will join the board and still be a major part of the press, we hope and plan.
So just to say again, this is all volunteer. We don't get paid for this. For the Washington Writers Publishing House, we're lucky to have, we occasionally get grants and donations, which is wonderful, and support through the different prizes. But it really is a love of the press and a love of the written word and the sort of dynamic, that powerhouse that we have within the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area that keeps us going. I mean, it's love and it's dedication and it's community and it's social, and it's about a dozen of us total, maybe, kind of, is that right?
Who are active.
Caroline, who are active. Many more, who have done their service and have stepped aside, which is, totally fine. But many have stayed on, as I have, as Caroline has, as Nicole has, after when the award is published. Yeah. And so you stay on it and you love it. It becomes part of your life, and it becomes a passion. And, passion has fueled, I think, this press for the 40 years that it's been alive and sustained. So,
and our books are sold not only at that big e-tailer, they are on that big e-tailer in print and in an ebook, but they're also available at bookshop.org. They're available at local independent bookstores like the wonderful Ivy in Baltimore, at One More Page Books in Arlington, and at Politics and Prose in DC. So we have a nice footprint for a small volunteer independent press. And we hope people out there will think of joining us by submitting to their manuscripts or submitting to WWPH Writes. We now consider everyone who submits and becomes a part of that an honorary member.
Absolutely. No, but part of this panel was, what drives a small press, and I think it's dedication and it's passion, and it's wonderful, of course, when you do your own writing and your own writing is published, which is wonderful. We all love that. But it's also exquisitely satisfying to lift other writers up and have their voices heard and spoken, to have Andrew's story, to have Liz's story, Nicole's poem, Sandra's poem, to be able to have the platform for that is wonderful, and it's a passion, and we're dedicated, and we hope that you check us out. Definitely. Yeah.
So Jonah and I will wrap up and each read one short piece. Jonah, do you want to start, or would you like me to?
I'll start actually, because I think we should end with Caroline, her beautiful words. So I'm going to read a very short poem from Said Through Glass, which won the Gene Feldman Poetry Prize a few years ago from the Washington Writers Publishing House. Okay, so since Andrew mentioned his name in a poem, and Nicole mentioned her name in a poem, I'm going to read my one poem that has my name, though it's not me, right? So, quick backstory. My partner has a sailboat, and I go by Jonah, right? So if you know, sort of in biblical Christian mythology, you know, the idea of Jonah on a boat is not so great, okay? So some people went out one day and they're like, oh, your name's Jonah. Oh my God, you're bad luck on a boat. And so this is kind of my response to my name and being on a boat and the whole whale and all that stuff. So this poem is called Jonah's Whale. We sail out on the first weekend of the season into a northwest wind over a springing bay of fish and crab. I rest on the stern, burning my mouth on a wind-hot ash, and watch the lighthouse pass by as easily as hands navigate a new body. I think my mother will soon die. What a strange thought to have, sailing toward the bridge under a hot sun. Only 2 hours out and already there is death. I think there is something beneath us, perhaps a whale, only it is not. We are in the bay, not the ocean, where I can go days and weeks and never reach land. I decide I am on the whale, its belly full of me, full of Jonah. In the cockpit, 2 birds, 2 heads in galley. Being inside, I know this is how one starts a planet and keeps digging to forget light and diesel fuel. Inside this whale, I have been 5 Spanish boys languishing on the beaches of Barcelona. I have been a queen sailing to a conquered empire. Oh, Chesapeake, I have grown up near your body all my life and stopped on your shores that smell like innards of fish and birds. You are a king my mother has never seen, but only reads about in the pages of my voyage. She knows how I am tossed about in the cabin and eat salt like caviar. The boat keeps going as though nothing else were happening, as if she is not dying. Each hour, ripping through the bay, slicing down the innards, the belly, the rib cage, ripping through, knot by nautical knot, in bloodstreams and decay. My whale is fast and knows the way.
Yay, Jonah. Yay, I love that. Well, I'm going to wrap up on a poem about, not a poem, a piece of flash fiction that is about community. So as I mentioned at the top, I came down from New York 8 years ago with my family, and I didn't know a soul. And I took a class at the Writers Center in Bethesda. Big shout out to our friends there. And I met a group of writers, and this formed my first community, and we're still together 8 years later. So this is a very close to the bone piece of flash fiction, but I thought it speaks to that idea Jonah said about community. And it's from my 2018 collection, Carry Her Home. The Critique Group. We talk about giving birth and menopause, about celebrities we would jump in bed with if we had the opportunity, about being married forever from one of us and not having a date in 18 months, shit, maybe more, and about your grandmother. How is she? Her home in Chevy Chase is being sold. 90 years old, and my parents have decided that she cannot live alone anymore. The unreliable furnace and those long flights of stairs leading to all those unopened rooms. We gather closer to her, the youngest among us, and urge her to write more about her grandmother, about what matters and what terrifies, what we think to ourselves. How did we find one another? How lucky we are. 4 women poised between 29 and 50. What we say aloud, we should meet more often. We drink more wine, weep, scream, beat our fists against one another, laugh while gulping for air, a certain power in us to write about anything. And he always arrives late, slick with sweat, riding his bicycle on even the coldest of nights, changing the pheromones in the wide open room. When he says, "Did I miss anything?" we say, "We haven't even started." So my tribute to the writing community in the DMV, which has nurtured me, as has Jonah, as has all of you tonight. So thank you for being a part of This Is What America Looks Like, for engaging all our viewers out there in what a small, independent, nonprofit, all volunteer cooperative press can do.
Absolutely, right? I mean, you take a group of dedicated individuals who love the written word, love poetry, love fiction. You get them together and you can make magic. You can make books and you can celebrate writers and authors. You're not going to be a millionaire, but you are going to raise the spirit and raise people up. And I think it's just a wonderfully satisfying, and I'm so proud to be a part of it. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for being.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Such a great tradition. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sandra, Andrew, Liz, Nicole. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, Sandra, Liz, Egan, Nicole, Tong,
Until next time.
Until next time. Thank
and
you all so much.
Donna Colson.
And Caroline Bach.
Yay.
Love it. Thank you, everyone.
I think we must be wrapping up. We're exactly on time. We are so good. It's 8:28. We did it. Is our session host here? Thank you to 1455 and Sean Murphy and all the behind the scenes people who must be working very hard to make this happen.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think we can all leave now.
If we were all in person, we'd be all walking to the same place.
Yes, well, we'd all be drinking a glass of wine if you're at any reading for me.
That's awesome. Thank you all so much.
Okay, my friends, thank you.
Bye,
Until we
everyone.
see
Thanks,
each other in
everyone.
person or again.